Shadows are calling, the curtain is drawn. How far we've fallen, I'm out on the run. Live in the violence, die by the sword. Deep in the fire, that's where darkness is born.
Previously, we discussed the events of New Year's Day when Matthews Livelsberger, a Green Beret, blew himself and a Cybertruck up in front of Trump Tower in Las Vegas, Nevada, in what he would claim was a wake-up call to Americans, as he expressed warnings that America is headed toward collapse. Now, if you listen to the update I posted between this episode and its part 1, you heard that this past week I was actually staying at the Venetian Hotel for work on the Las Vegas Strip, and the view out my room's window was in fact Trump Tower. It was really eerie. So the events of New Year's Day were definitely top of mind for me, and I kept thinking about the level of mental instability you would have to drive from the place that Matthew rented the Cybertruck up in Denver, Colorado, all the way to Las Vegas. And Matthew took a very scenic detour. He drove down through New Mexico and Arizona, which I've actually driven that same route in the past when I lived in Colorado Springs, and I would go down through New Mexico and to Phoenix to visit my family several times. It's a long haul with plenty of dashboard and thinking time. I think about what level of delusion or grandiosity must a person be in to make a trip that long and follow through on an act like the one Matthew committed. For those who knew Matthew very intimately, they, and maybe they alone, know that his mental health had been in a dire state for years. An ex-girlfriend Matthew was with years prior to this desperate final act would actually share with the media that Matthew had confided her all the way back in 2018 that he was mentally spiraling. She said that Matthew shared with her that he was so hopeless and depressed that it was hard for him to go on. And in Matthew's final writings as to the reason why he wanted to end his life, the man with several deployments under his belt, who had witnessed countless deaths of friends as well as war crimes and the deaths of both innocent civilians and even enemies of war, he would say, "Why did I personally do it now? I needed to cleanse my mind of the brothers I've lost and relieve myself of the burden of the lives I took." And as much as I get upset anytime a service member or veteran dies by their own hand, I'm incredibly relieved that Matthew ended his life without taking out his wife and child. The number of men who are reeling from PTSD or traumatic brain injuries or both who have lost hope because they can no longer close their eyes without seeing death, and then they take their families with them, it's really common, and that fact is hard to refute. And these murders are usually triggered by an event, a wife leaving them, or being reported to their chain of command, being medically discharged, something that will knock down that first domino, and for whatever reason, so many of these men suffering take loved ones with them. And so I will say, as much as this story is a tragedy of yet another soldier dying by suicide, it's also a best-case scenario because nobody else was taken with him. And while Matthew Livelsberger was busy preparing for his final act by utilizing ChatGPT to work out the details, and he was giving final thoughts to the bloodshed he had witnessed, the lives he took, and the lives of his beloved teammates that were taken from him, another veteran nearly 2,000 miles away from Las Vegas was planning a very different event that would also occur on New Year's Day. But this one would be dramatically more gruesome and even maniacal. And it would be planned meticulously with the sole intent of killing as many innocent people as possible. Shamsud-Din Jabbar was a 42-year-old man, an Army veteran turned terrorist suspect who is believed to be responsible for the death of 14 innocent people and the harm and injury of more than, I believe, 57 people, is the count right now, who were simply out ringing in the new year on January 1st of 2025 on Bourbon Street in New Orleans. Friends and family members would refer to Shamsud-Din as Sham and described him as a reserved and kind individual who diligently and proudly served his country for nearly a decade. However, In the aftermath of this horrific event, a more radicalized image of Shamsud-Din would emerge, and one that leaves me questioning if this is another example of a veteran failed by the system whose mental health was so impaired from their service that they became vulnerable and more susceptible to extremism. Well, I don't say this to make an excuse for the horrific acts Shamsud-Din committed. I do say it to raise awareness that men like Shamsud-Din, who struggle with their transition from military life to civilian life, are highly susceptible to radicalization. Shamsud-Din Jabbar, whose name and appearance had many people jumping to the conclusion that he was either an illegal immigrant or someone not of American citizenship when he was first identified, was actually an all-American kid. Born and raised in a small eastern Texas town called Beaumont in a Christian family, Shamsud-Din was known by many from his hometown as a polite kid with a polished style. Shamsud-Din often opted to dress in button-down shirts and polos and had a desire to serve his country. Upon graduating from high school, Shamsud-Din tried to join the Navy but left after only a month, opting to join the Army instead. He worked as a human resource specialist and information technology specialist from 2007 to 2015 and was highly regarded as a person who took great pride in his work. His unit deployed to Afghanistan from February 2009 to January 2010, just shy of a year. His commander would write on social media that he worked quietly and professionally as a human resource officer and a mail clerk in Afghanistan, ensuring that the little things that kept all of the service members connected to home were done with care and precision. Now, I want to pause for a moment to acknowledge something here. Many times, people think that only service members who see combat in their deployments will come home with PTSD, but statistically, that's not true at all. Many service members who never see any combat will be just as impacted as those who do, and it's for several reasons. Some of those reasons include witnessing serious incidences or being involved in traumatic medical situations. Sometimes it's the death of a fellow service member that impacts them. It can be sexual assault or trauma. It can be serving in a very high-stress environment, or it can simply be exposure to ongoing death and violence, though not directly witnessing it. And sometimes it can just be the trauma of trying to reintegrate into civilian society and feeling isolated and misunderstood by civilians. There are so many reasons that people can develop PTSD, and while I'm not sure if this is something that Shamsud-Din was suffering from, I just want to acknowledge that many active duty service members and veterans who never see any form of combat still endure grave impact to their mental health. So Shamsud-Din served his country, and when he left active duty in 2015, he would go on to be an Army reservist from 2015 to 2020. He also enrolled in a bachelor's program at Georgia State University, utilizing his GI Bill and graduating in 2017 with a degree in computer information systems. While at Georgia State, Shamsud-Din was quoted in the school newspaper about the challenges of trying to navigate life after the military as a veteran. He talked about how difficult it was to fit into the world as you transition out and find yourself feeling like you speak a completely different language, being so reliant on speaking in acronyms. He acknowledged he sometimes struggled to remember what was a military acronym and what wasn't, and he vented about the challenges of receiving GI Bill payments, saying you really had to be diligent and stay on top of it to receive those payments from the Department of Veteran Affairs. So it sounds like some financial stress. He looked back on his time in the service fondly, encouraging others to join, and he really struggled in the civilian world, something I think many veterans can attest to. And this is often when most veterans who die by suicide will actually end their lives. That transition into finding your footing after service is such a critical time for service members. And for Shamsud-Din, he tried his hands at entrepreneurship as a real estate agent, but lost a great deal of money, and that career was short-lived. But then he landed at a large consulting firm, Deloitte, making a decent salary of $120,000 annually. However, Shamsud-Din's personal life was a mess, to say the least. He had one marriage that ended during his military service in 2012, a second that ended in 2016, and in 2021, he was going through his third divorce, and he was unable to make his house payments, allegedly due to paying child support or alimony or whatever have you, and his living expenses were out of his ability to keep up with. Shamsud-Din spoke of possibly facing foreclosure and was incredibly stressed about his financial state. Friends and family would say that Shamsud-Din was raised in a Christian family, but had decided to become Muslim on his own many years ago. However, he had never been an extremist to their knowledge in his life, but a devout Muslim who honored the praying and alcohol and party-free lifestyle. His brother would say that Shamsud-Din was kind, and he even showed up at the house to help bathe and care for his ailing father, who recently had a stroke. But he had also grown very upset and even displayed a great deal of agitation when discussing what was happening in Gaza, saying that it was a genocide on both sides. After his third divorce, Shamsud-Din became more devout, and religion became the centralized focus of his life, it would seem. But friends and family still think he had in any way become radicalized. He frequently posted on social media about his faith, but was always positive and peaceful about it. But in the months leading to the attack, the mother of two of Shamsud-Din's daughters and her husband would notice a change in Shamsud-Din. And I often say it's imperative that when we notice someone struggling mentally or we are not sure what's going on, that we look to and consult those who have known him the most intimately, or look at what they're reporting. It's often an ex-girlfriend, an ex-wife, a current spouse, or a girlfriend. They're the ones who really have a pulse on the situation. And for the mother of Shamsud-Din's daughters, or her and her husband, they felt he had become erratic and was behaving unpredictably, so much so that they had told his daughters, who I believe were both nearing adulthood or older at least, they told them they could no longer spend time with him while he was in this unstable state. And their gut instinct was correct, because it was at that exact time that he had been planning the horrible terrorist attack. And what we now know is that on November 10th of 2024, Shamsud-Din took a train from Houston, Texas to New Orleans and then returned to Texas that evening on a bus. While in the city, Shamsud-Din looked at an apartment to rent on Bourbon Street. Just days after his travel, he applied to rent the apartment, but later told the landlord that he had changed his mind. An initial review of his electronics shows Shamsud-Din conducted several online searches in preparation for his attack. They included searches on how to access a balcony on Bourbon Street. Now we know why he wanted to rent that apartment. Information about Mardi Gras, and he researched several shootings in the city as late as mid-November. And just hours before the attack on Bourbon Street, he also searched for information about the car that rammed into innocent victims in a Christmas market in Germany just 10 days before. It seemed he was desperately seeking out information on what he could utilize as weaponry and how he could inflict the most amount of death upon innocent people. Horrific. On the morning of New Year's Eve, one of Shamsud-Din's neighbors would see him loading a white truck that was unfamiliar outside of his home. He approached Shamsud-Din, and Shamsud-Din told him that he was actually moving to Louisiana as he had gotten a job there. But what happened next was obviously much more sinister. The electric truck that the neighbor had spotted Shamsud-Din loading had been rented on December 30th from the online car-sharing marketplace Turo that allows people to rent cars directly from local hosts. It's essentially Airbnb for cars. So he rented that truck, and he would drive it from Houston to New Orleans on New Year's Eve. And at some point, he would post 5 time-stamped videos to an online platform between 1:29 a.m. and 3:02 a.m. Central Time, where he allegedly proclaims his support for ISIS. In the first video, he explains that he originally planned to kill his family and friends, but was concerned that the news headlines would not focus on the war between, quote, the believers and the disbelievers. Also disconcerting that he didn't think it would be a big impact to kill friends and family members. People are becoming numb to familicide because it's just all too common. Him gathering his ex-wives and children and loved ones and killing them wouldn't nearly cause the global news and disruption that his terrorist attack on Bourbon Street actually did, which it's all disturbing, honestly. So in these videos, Shamsud-Din also divulges that he joined ISIS before that summer of 2024. At 2:03 a.m., there was surveillance footage which showed Shamsud-Din walking along Dauphine Street near Governor Nichols Street. It is later determined he was placing explosive devices inside coolers near Bourbon Street before the attack, and he seemed to be acting alone. At 3:02 a.m., he posts his last video. He then proceeds to ram his truck into a crowd on Bourbon Street with an ISIS flag attached to the trailer hitch, and he would then emerge from the truck after crashing it and open fire on the crowd. He engaged in a shootout with police, finally being killed by an officer returning fire. And in the end, 14 innocent lives were taken and 57 individuals injured, as previously mentioned. And everyone who knows Shamsud-Din Jabbar seems to be have left completely baffled. Well, except for the ex-wives, probably. The FBI believes, after much research, that in 2022, Shamsud-Din became a much more devout Muslim, but it wasn't until the spring of 2024 that he started following extremist views and engaging in radicalized behavior. Which honestly, that scares the hell out of me. It's so hard to imagine that a person could adopt a radicalized view in the spring of 2024, and then less than 6 months later in November, he's planning to commit mass murder. In the aftermath, many people have wondered how two veterans would both commit these types of acts within hours of each other and with several commonalities in these situations. And I wanted to address those commonalities that Matthew Livelsberger and Shamsud-Din Jabbar shared. Both Matthew and Shamsud-Din served in the Army with a time of overlap at the same base, Fort Bragg. Both were in Afghanistan at overlapping times. Both rented electric trucks from the app Toro and drove them across state lines before their final life-ending acts. But to me, this is where the similarities end. Now, the military has confirmed that they never overlapped physically, at least, in any of their roles. And of course, beyond that, I just find their specific agendas to be too vastly different to be working in tandem. Now, Matthew was suffering from PTSD and possibly a traumatic brain injury. He had witnessed major war crimes and seemed to be in belief of some more grandiose covert operations happening with the Chinese spying on Americans and drones, anti-gravity drones. He was in a downward trajectory mentally, and his wife had left him around this time with his child. We hear rumors that it was for alleged infidelity and, a lot of these guys cheat, but perhaps it was for her own safety. And I encourage everyone to do this if their partner is displaying erratic, unstable behavior. So I fully support her in this action and no blame on her. Her and her child may very well be alive because she left him. And that's no shade towards Matthew. That's just facts about veterans' mental health and familicide. Matthew was unstable, and he could no longer deal with the death and destruction he had not only witnessed, but participated in. He was a devout Trump supporter and was excited about the rising administration. He even wrote about encouraging martial law of Americans to rise up and get in the streets, get loud, and support the new administration, which, no thank you on martial law. So he was definitely speaking radically in some ways. But for those of you who think that Matthew was working with Shamsud-Din Jabbar, I'd just like to point out that ISIS is not at all fans of Donald Trump. In fact, a prominent ISIS leader was killed in a raid in northwestern Syria in 2019 under the direction of Donald Trump. So more than anything, they don't want him in office, nor are they happy about this administration. Now, let me just give you a quick rundown of ISIS, because I think we all know the general basis of what a terrorist is. But I'll give a little more in-depth explanation. We all talk about it and hear about it so much, a lot of us may not know the little details, but ISIS stands for the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria. They're a transnational Salafi jihadist group, meaning they practice a violent Sunni Islamist ideology that uses force to establish global dominance, and they're an unrecognized quasi-state. They're known around the world as a designated terrorist organization and by the United Nations in many countries, including Muslim countries. This group has conducted and inspired terrorist attacks worldwide, resulting in thousands and thousands of people being killed and injured. They use targeted killings, IED or intermittent explosive devices for attacks, ambushes, military-style assaults, kidnappings, and suicide attacks in Iraq and Syria. They encourage supporters worldwide to conduct operations in their own countries using readily available weapons. And it's important to note that ISIS claims to be real Muslims and the legitimate ruler of all Sunni Muslims, but they are not. They hold an extremely radical interpretation of Islam, and you'll find traditional Muslims to be peaceful as a culture. ISIS members want to create a state called caliphate across Iraq, Syria, and beyond. That's their main goal. And ISIS, this is scary, it uses modern tools like social media to promote reactionary politics and religious fundamentalism. They destroy holy sites and have revenue from oil production, smuggling, taxes, ransoms from kidnapping, selling stolen items, extortion, and controlling crops. In short, ISIS is horrifying. Now, these two men who had dedicated their lives to the army, both in many ways, couldn't have more opposite agendas. So I can't imagine a world where these two could find common ground. Perhaps you think these two were in contact because they wanted mutually assured destruction, right? They just wanted to do as much damage as they could, regardless of their ideals, but I just don't buy that. I don't think Matthew's endgame was to take anyone with him. I just think he wanted to use fireworks and create a memorable scene to bring awareness to his cause, and he also wanted to end the mental turmoil that he was agonizing over for years. And if we look at Shamsud-Din Jabbar, this too is a man who was obviously spiraling mentally, and during that downward decline, he adopted extremist views and would go on to support ISIS. It's hard to believe someone that was once described as kind and polite and a great service member could fall prey to the teachings of such a hate-filled group. But many veterans have become extremists, sadly, often targeted for their knowledge and skills when they're mentally unstable. It's a threat that the military must consider when service members officially leave the service, and the VA has to do a better job of supporting veterans mentally. The VA is the largest integrated health system in the United States. If you're not familiar with that term, an integrated health system is one that takes a collaborative approach to care. They try to look at the patient holistically. They combine their physical, mental, behavioral aspects of healthcare all as one. And yet, it's still a struggle for many veterans to navigate and receive timely care through the VA. And I see problems like the ones the VA has. I see it in many health systems across America, this being the career field I am in. My education is actually a master's degree in healthcare administration. So these are things I strategize on and consider regularly. And the biggest problem I see with the VA is a lack of communication between VA providers and non-VA providers. Whether a patient has serious ailments that requires a patient to go outside the VA providers, or they live in rural areas that require they go to a non-VA provider, the fact is many veterans need to acquire care with community physicians or just outside the Veteran Affairs network. So often, the patient is bounced around to different specialists and they aren't communicating with each other. And not only that, but the electronic medical records system from the VA won't always communicate with non-VA electronic medical record systems. So the patient then becomes their own record keeper. They're like toting around their x-rays and their notes and having to re-explain everything to the next provider. And this, even if you're not VA, this is probably familiar to you because a lot of healthcare out there is really disjointed. The patient's physical systems are treated independently instead of by a team of specialists. What I mean is a patient will see their nephrologist who's treating their kidney disease, but that nephrologist is not talking to their cardiologist, and these providers very much need to be working synergistically with each other for the best possible patient outcomes, and they're just not. And my heart breaks daily as I hear these stories of patients failed because of long wait times to see specialists and overlooked ailments. A lack of communication between providers and a lack of information sharing and poor communication, making the coordination of care just so difficult. The VA has just especially long wait times for patients. And so all of these factors together just make many people utilizing the VA services feel like they're getting very fragmented care. And it just can cause extreme fatigue for those dealing with mental health issues and other disabilities who can't get in to see providers they need to see. And I think what I'm left with is just this overarching feeling of wanting to tell the world to look out for the signs and try to help those struggling. Whether it's being a healthcare advocate, maybe you need to go to appointments with your loved one or help them find someone who's more well versed in healthcare to help navigate the VA's system. These men are so susceptible to suicide, to committing murder, and to radicalization. Those who feel isolated and without a community, those with a strong need for belonging, a sense of injustice or discrimination, those who are in identity crises, which I often think those leaving the military service are feeling identity crises. I want you to pay close attention to the service members and veterans in your life. If they are becoming more withdrawn or more isolated, if they're less willing to go in public, if they're more agitated, these are all major red flags that something more is going on. If you're noticing that they're obsessing on subject matter, extremely irate, or caught up on specific issues, this can be signs that they're radicalized. Behaviors of grandiosity, and what I mean by that is behavior or an attitude of an exaggerated sense of self-worth or importance, a sense of entitlement, or even dismissing others' achievements, acting as if rules don't apply. This can be present when a person is having a manic episode. Sometimes, when a person is exemplifying changes in behavior or speech or attitude or appearance and has an immense need for belonging, these can be signs they're being radicalized. If they're justifying the use of violence as a solution for a social issue, or even maybe they're refusing to engage with people they have in the past because they have different viewpoints, please pay attention. We see more and more veterans falling victim to radicalization as we see more veterans impacted by the global war on terrorism than we have seen in other wars, simply because of the length of time this war has gone on. Since 2001, we've had a presence in the Middle East, and some of these veterans are well into the double digits of deployments under their belts. That is a long time to be living in a heightened state of stress, panic, and bearing witness to and even perhaps participating in the most depraved acts humans can commit. We can't expect these men to return to normalcy without severe impact to their mental health. So I beg of you, pay attention to the veterans in your life. If you're worried, ask for help, whether it's the VA or you have to take them to a mental health hospital. If they never talk to you again, at least they're alive. At least you're alive. If you and your children are living with a person who you believe is acting erratically and maybe even radicalized, make a safety plan and get out, and then get them help. Don't approach them about it. Hell, tell them you're taking the kids to visit family when they're on temporary duty somewhere. I don't care what you have to do. Slip out when they aren't around. Tell them you're going to 7-Eleven, just Piggly Wiggly, wherever you are. Just get to safety, but don't talk yourself out of it, because we see these murders of families and loved ones over and over again by veterans struggling. If you listen to my update between part 1 of this episode, you know that I have found the identity of the woman who was found dead in Kaneohe Bay, Hawaii on September 1st of 2024. Her name is Ruby Araceli Tenorio. Her married name was Ruby Alcantar. Nobody has released this information. Not a media outlet, not a single military representative. I've only received all of this information from talking to people on base and sleuthing some on the internet. So it is being completely kept under wraps and not spoken of. Ruby's husband, Alfonso Alcantar, is being kept in confinement, though he hasn't been charged with anything. I suspect he murdered her, and insiders say this is what he's going to be charged with. But why is the military staying silent? I mean, we know that Dwayne is locked up in the brig for the murder. He's being charged with the murder of Misha Johnson and their child. We know about them. Why aren't they releasing the identity on this? We have this woman's body. We don't have Misha's body or the baby's. So I think it's just too much. It's just too much domestic violence. This is the same base that Donna Alataibi was brutally murdered while stationed at in 2022 by her estranged husband, a Marine. And so join me Thursday as I do a deep dive about Dana's story and how she too was failed by the military. But you know what? I want more answers. I want to know why nearly 5 months later, if you Google the name Ruby Araceli Tenorio, the only thing you'll find is links to my Instagram and podcast and her obituary, and nothing else. The military needs to stop covering up domestic violence and murders and actively making changes to their systems. Also, a woman found dead in a Japanese hotel room in October of this year, a military spouse, her Marine husband detained as well, and still 0 details have been released about their identity. If Brass thinks they can make these things go away by just not releasing the details, they're sadly mistaken, because I'm not going to let it go and I'm not going to stop ranting about it. If you have details you'd like me to share or you want to anonymously let me know something, please email me at healingwounds13@gmail.com. If you'd be so kind, the very best thing you can do to help me keep this show going is to give me a 5-star review and a written review wherever you get your podcast. That would truly mean the world to me. Thanks for listening. Please stay safe.